Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'akol niyeh bidvaro. We find in the Bible, in the Torah, that Jacob, the third patriarch, that spent 17 years in Egypt, the last 17 years of his life, makes his children promise him, things are very good in Egypt, but I want to be buried in the land of Israel. Including his son Joseph, who was like a prime minister in Israel. He also tells his brothers, I want to be buried in Israel. And it wasn't a simple thing, because according to the Torah, Joseph had to ask somebody to ask Pharaoh for permission for him to go to bury his father in Israel. Wasn't that simple at all? Why not? Well, obviously, if you want to be buried in another place, it means that this place is not really your permanent home. You didn't assimilate, you didn't integrate really to this society. If at the end of your days you don't want to remain here, you want to go back somewhere else. Well, Jacob says, I want to rest together with my ancestors. And there's something called Me'arat HaMachpelah. This is a place that Abraham bought as a burial place for his wife Sarah, and it became the burial place for the patriarchs, Me'arat HaMachpelah, and to this day you can visit in Israel. Joseph, on the other hand, did not insist on Me'arat HaMachpelah. I think that the tomb of Joseph is someplace near Nablus in the territories in Israel. It's in the valley, I think, of Har Eval and Har Gerizim, two mountains that are prominent in the Bible because the blessing and the curse was going to be pronounced from these two mountains. And that's where Joseph is buried. Jacob wanted to be buried with his ancestors, with his family. Joseph wanted the land of Israel. He didn't insist on Me'arat HaMachpelah. As a matter of fact, one can ask, why wasn't Joseph the fourth patriarch? He was actually the firstborn of Jacob. Well, Reuben was the oldest, but Reuben was the son of Leah, who was not the preferred spouse, the preferred wife of Jacob. On the other hand, Joseph was the firstborn of his preferred wife, Rachel. And as a matter of fact, Jacob divided Joseph into two tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim. So two tribes came out of Joseph. Because he was the firstborn, he got a double portion. So Joseph should have been the fourth patriarch, maybe, but maybe not. Why? Because he was maybe too Egyptian. He was already involved with the culture of Egypt. He was an official in the land of Egypt. Maybe his connection with the land of Israel wasn't strong enough. Yet we find that when it comes to dying, he says, I want the land of Israel. Why? Because it shows that even Joseph knew that he is a foreigner in Egypt. He may have power in Egypt. He may be very prominent. But at the last moment, the last line, when push meets shove, you have to choose between Egypt and the Promised Land. I remember in Caracas, there was a gentleman who had been born in Europe, but lived in the interior of the country and eventually moved to Caracas. And when I met him, he was already a man in years. He spoke Spanish very well. Hardly, no accent at all. In my case, I was raised in Peru, so Spanish was almost my mother tongue. But this gentleman came already as a young man, yet he spoke Spanish he had become tremendously integrated into Venezuelan society. Yet he left in his will that he wants to be buried in Israel. His family didn't believe that. I couldn't believe that. A gentleman like that who was so assimilated, yet he felt. Notwithstanding the many years he had lived in Venezuela, Venezuela was not really his homeland. The homeland of the Jewish people is Israel, and he wants to be buried in Israel. There are many people, for religious reasons, they feel that when the Messiah will come, it'll be easier if you live in Israel. My late father is buried in Israel. He never stepped foot in Israel in his lifetime. He never had the opportunity to do that. Born in Poland, lived in Peru during the war, and he died when he was still relatively young, but yet he had acquired a resting place in Israel, and his remains are in Israel. It means something, where your burial place is, because you're really choosing where the destiny of the Jewish people is. Nowadays, with augmentation, increment in anti-Semitic sentiments, one doubts, should I remain forever in the land where I live, or maybe my physical remains should go to Israel, because that is really the destination and the destiny of the Jewish people. Think about it. I think Joseph understood that very well. Even though he was very powerful in Egypt, at the last moment he knew he was not an Egyptian, and his remains should be in Israel. Think about it.